All right, so today we're diving into some pretty intense diplomacy.
Oh, yeah.
Argentina's recent agreements with the UK over the Falkland Islands,
Okay.
or, as I'm sure you already know them, the Islas Malvinas.
Right, right.
And we're looking at, well, frankly, a pretty scathing opinion piece
Okay.
by Enrique Aurelli,
Right.
and he does not hold back. He calls these agreements surrender pacts.
Wow. Surrender pacts. That's strong language. What's he reacting to there?
Well, this is a hugely sensitive issue in Argentina, as you can imagine.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
It's about way more than just, some islands way down in the South Atlantic.
right.
It's about national pride, historical memory.
Mm-hmm.
The wounds from the 1982 conflict are still very, very raw for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a heavy weight to carry, when you're talking about these kinds of things.
Absolutely. And Aureli's really tapping into that deep well of emotion.
Okay.
He's specifically focused on two agreements, the 2016 Foradori-Duncan agreement,
Mm-hmm.
and then this newer one, the 2024 Mondino-Lammy agreement.
All right, so spanning almost a decade there.
Yeah, almost a decade.
So what is it about these agreements? I mean, what makes them so controversial?
Well, on the surface, they're all about, trying to promote economic cooperation.
Okay.
Fishing rights, flights, trade, that kind of thing.
Right, right. Standard stuff, trying to, maybe smooth things over a little bit.
Exactly. But Aureli's argument is that these economic concessions, as he sees them,
Yeah.
actually cut to the heart of Argentina's claim over the islands in the first place.
I see.
He sees it as almost legitimizing the UK's control
Okay.
and undermining Argentina's sovereignty.
So he's saying that by making these concessions, Argentina is sort of tacitly agreeing to something that it fundamentally disagrees with?
Exactly. He really zeroes in on this idea that Argentina is giving away way too much.
Like what? What are some examples?
Well, one example that he cites is fishing licenses.
Okay, fishing. Right, big industry down there.
Hugely important, yeah. And potentially worth millions of dollars in revenue.
Wow. So, I mean, is there data to back that up?
That's a good question. And what would those potential economic losses mean for Argentina? I mean, how significant are we talking here?
Yeah, because millions has a nice ring to it, but it's all relative, right?
It is.
So what's the scale?
Yeah, there's a lot of squid, right?
Yeah, squid is the big one down there. I mean, it's a huge industry. They call it, what is it, calamari, I think is how they refer to it.
Yeah, and it's not, we're not just talking about, fancy restaurants in Buenos Aires. I mean, this is people's livelihoods.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, coastal communities, this is how they make their living. And so, when you start talking about potentially millions of dollars, that's a lot of families, that's a lot of jobs, it's a big deal.
Yeah. So Aureli's argument hinges on this idea that Argentina gets a bad deal,
Right.
that they're making these big economic concessions,
Right.
but not getting much in return. So what are the counter arguments to that? Why might Argentina actually see these agreements as worthwhile, even with these concessions?
Well, I mean, you have to kind of zoom out a little bit, right, and look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
Argentina's walking a tightrope here. I mean, on the one hand, they've got a really strong claim to the Falklands.
Mm-hmm.
It's enshrined in their constitution, which I think we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah, we should definitely get into that.
Yeah, because that's a whole other can of worms. But the flip side is they also have to engage with the UK.
Right.
Which is a global power with a very clear interest in maintaining its presence in the South Atlantic.
Yeah, it's not like they're just going to walk away from this.
No, it's a very strategically important location. And so Argentina has to kind of weigh those two things, right? The strength of their claim versus the realities of the geopolitical situation.
So you mentioned the Argentine Constitution.
Right.
Aureli claims these agreements actually violate it.
Okay.
How does that even work? How can an international agreement violate a country's constitution?
Right. So it's a really interesting legal and kind of rhetorical move that Aureli's making here.
Okay.
Because Article 25 of Argentina's constitution, it very clearly prioritizes reclaiming sovereignty over the Malvinas.
Okay.
That's what they call them, the Malvinas.
Right.
But by invoking the constitution, Aureli's framing these agreements as not just bad policy,
Mm-hmm.
but potentially illegal acts,
Right.
It's a betrayal of the nation's, core values.
Okay, so, but legally speaking, could that argument actually hold up? I mean, could you go to court and overturn an international agreement because it violates one country's constitution?
That's where it gets really tricky. I mean, it's highly unlikely that an international court would, actually overturn these agreements based on Argentina's constitution. But, legally sound or not, this argument, it plays a really powerful role in shaping public opinion in Argentina.
Oh, for sure.
Right, because he's appealing to a very deep-seated sense of injustice.
Right.
There's this feeling that their government is prioritizing pragmatism
Right.
over principle.
Yeah, it's like selling out kind of in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that resonates with a lot of people.
Okay. So Aurelli also, he throws in this kind of colorful anecdote about the 2016 agreement.
Oh, yeah.
He implies that the UK minister involved claimed that the Argentine official was, well, let's just say not entirely sober during the negotiations.
Oh, wow. Okay. So we're getting into some gossip here.
A little bit. I mean, it's an entertaining story.
Sure.
But how much weight should we actually give an anecdote like that when we're analyzing a serious diplomatic agreement?
Right. I mean, it's juicy. It's definitely juicy. And it plays into this whole narrative that Aureli's constructing of Argentina being, kind of outmaneuvered in these negotiations. But it's also important to remember that these kinds of anecdotes, they can be very easily distorted or taken out of context.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Right. Especially, if we don't know where this information is coming from.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a little bit like, it's a grain of salt situation.
Yeah, so it might raise eyebrows, get people talking.
Right.
But it's not exactly hard evidence of any foul play.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a good reminder, though, that a lot of diplomacy happens, behind closed doors.
Oh, for sure.
Right?
Yeah.
What we see publicly, the handshakes, the agreements, that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
There's always backroom deals and unwritten understandings and, maybe a few too many cocktails involved. But, at the end of the day, the text of the agreement, that's what really matters.
That's what we got to look at.
Right. We can speculate all day long about who said what and who was drinking what, but the agreement itself, that's the meat of the matter.
Okay, so let's get into the weeds a little bit.
All right.
And look at what Argentina is actually conceding in these agreements.
Yeah.
Because I think that's where Aureli's critique gets really interesting. He argues that even these seemingly small concessions, like allowing flights from Brazil to the Falklands, have these really significant implications for this bigger picture of sovereignty.
Interesting.
So more flights, I mean, on the surface, more air travel, that seems like it could benefit both sides, right?
Right.
Is Aureli just reading too much into this? Or is there something to his argument?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It all comes down to how you define benefit in this context.
Okay.
I mean, on a purely economic level,
Sure.
more flights, more tourism, potentially more trade, that could benefit both the Falklands and Argentina. But then there's also that symbolic dimension to consider.
Right.
And I think that's where Aureli is really coming from
because more flights could be seen as normalizing the Falklands as this separate entity.
Exactly.
Which obviously goes against Argentina's claim to the islands.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Aureli is getting at. He sees these, what seem like technical agreements as kind of chipping away at Argentina's claim little by little.
Yeah.
He says by making it easier for, economic integration, greater connectivity, Argentina's maybe accidentally, I don't know if he'd say accidentally, but they're legitimizing the status quo.
Right.
Making it harder to kind of assert their claims down the line.
Yeah. He's also not happy about Argentina not taking a stronger stance against the UK, just granting fishing licenses to other countries in those waters.
Right.
He frames it as giving away, millions of dollars worth of these valuable resources. So is he right? I mean, is that...
Well, I mean, like we're saying, the waters around the Falklands, they are incredibly rich in marine life.
Right.
Squid, especially, like we were talking about, huge, lucrative catch.
Yeah.
And Argentina has long said that the UK is basically exploiting these resources that rightfully belong to them. And so Aureli's tapping into that frustration, highlighting another example, in his view, of Argentina getting a raw deal.
The UK would argue, though, that they have the right to control those fishing grounds.
Sure.
Given that they control the islands.
Right. Well, and that's the heart of the issue, right? I mean, international maritime law,
Yeah.
it's dense. There are a lot of conflicting interpretations.
Right.
The UK claims this 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone
Okay.
around the Falklands, and that, according to them, gives them the right to control fishing in that whole area.
Right.
Argentina obviously disputes this.
Right.
They say that their territorial rights extend way further.
Okay, so it's a bit of a stalemate.
Yeah, it becomes very much a legal back and forth
Right.
with, both sides being able to point to international law and make their case.
Right.
But I think what's important to remember is that, beyond these legal arguments,
Mm-hmm.
this has a very real consequences for the people involved,
Right.
for fishing communities in Argentina.
Absolutely. Are they directly impacted by these licenses that the UK is granting?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, fishing is a lifeline for a lot of these communities,
Right.
particularly in the southern coastal regions.
Right.
So yeah, these fishing disputes, they're not just, lines on a map.
Right. This is their livelihood.
This is how people make a living, yeah. Aureli's arguing that, their government should be doing more to
Mhm.
protect those interests,
Okay.
even if it means, taking a tougher stance against the UK.
So it's classic balancing, right?
Yeah.
National interest versus
Yeah.
the needs of these specific communities.
Yeah. And it's not always easy to strike that balance.
Oh, for sure. And Aureli clearly feels that Argentina is giving too much ground here.
He does, and he's not alone. I mean, there are many people in Argentina, those with ties to the fishing industry in particular, who share his concerns. They say that the government is prioritizing these, diplomatic relations
Yeah.
over the well-being of its own people.
Yeah. It's a tough needle to thread for sure.
It is, and it speaks to, this broader tension that we see in a lot of these international disputes, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Where you have, national pride and historical grievances on the one hand, and then you have these very real economic considerations on the other.
Aureli draws this very direct parallel between the 2016 agreement and then this newer 2024 agreement.
Oh, yeah.
He calls it a copy-paste job,
Wow.
implying that nothing has really changed in Argentina's approach.
Yeah.
So do you agree? Is it fair to say that nothing has changed?
Well, I mean, on the surface, yeah, there are definitely similarities, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they both focus on a lot of the same things.
Mm-hmm.
Trade, fishing, hydrocarbons exploration. But I think if you dig a little deeper,
Mhm.
there are some key differences that are worth noting. For example, the 2024 agreement.
Yeah.
It includes these provisions for cooperation on identifying the remains of Argentine soldiers who were buried in Darwin Cemetery after the 1982 war.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that seems like a significant development. But what does Aureli make of that?
Well, he's skeptical.
Yeah.
He's very skeptical. He acknowledges that it's a humanitarian gesture.
Okay.
But he also sees it as another way for the UK to kind of assert its control over the islands.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because by engaging in this seemingly benevolent act,
Right.
he's saying that the UK is kind of further solidifying its image as sort of the responsible caretaker of the Falklands, potentially even in the eyes of some Argentinians.
So almost like a clever bit of soft power.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Using this humanitarian act to further this broader political agenda.
And it all goes back to what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
About just the complexities of diplomacy.
Right. Sure.
I mean, these actions, they can have, multiple meanings.
Yeah.
They can be interpreted in all these different ways.
It all depends on your perspective.
Right.
What one side sees as a gesture of goodwill, the other side sees as calculated, as
Exactly.
manipulative, potentially.
And Aureli definitely seems to fall in that latter camp.
He does.
He ends his piece by quoting Mariano Moreno. Who's that?
So Mariano Moreno, he was a key figure in Argentina's struggle for independence
Okay.
back in the early 19th century. So, he's invoking a lot of history here.
Why do you think he does that? I mean, why go back that far?
Well, I think it's a powerful rhetorical tactic
Okay.
by connecting what's happening now
Right.
to this much larger, historical struggle.
Mm-hmm.
He's raising the stakes.
Okay.
He's basically saying these aren't just, some abstract diplomatic negotiations.
Right.
This is about, the very soul of Argentina.
Wow.
Their right to self-determination. And so by doing that, he's also implicitly, criticizing the government,
Right.
saying that, by entering into these agreements,
Yeah.
they're betraying that legacy.
So he's drawn a line in the sand.
He has.
But he leaves us with a lot to think about. I mean, is there any possibility for a win-win here? Or is this just going to be a zero-sum game no matter what?
That is, I think, the big question.
Right.
Yeah, and it's hard to say. I mean, you have Argentina, with this unwavering stance on sovereignty.
Right.
It's fueled by all this history,
Right.
national identity. And then on the other hand, you have the reality of the situation,
Right.
which is that, the UK has controlled these islands for decades.
Right.
They're not going to cede control easily.
So where do we go from here? Is there a middle ground?
That's the million-dollar question. I think, Aurelli, with his focus on reclaiming sovereignty,
Right.
he seems to suggest that any compromise is a betrayal.
Right.
But, there are others who argue that that kind of purely adversarial approach,
Yeah.
it could be counterproductive in the long run.
Okay.
They say that Argentina needs to engage with the UK, not just on the Falklands,
Mm.
but on all these other issues, right? I mean, trade,
Sure.
climate change, all these areas where cooperation is essential.
So find areas of cooperation, even if it doesn't involve just, saying, okay, the Falklands are yours.
Right.
Oh.
And I think that's where the real challenge lies.
Right.
It's finding those areas where you can build trust, mutual benefit, even within the constraints of this very old dispute.
Yeah. Do you think that's possible? I mean, do you see...
I think so. It's definitely a delicate dance. I mean, any hint of compromise from Argentina
Right.
could create this huge backlash domestically.
Yeah.
Especially from those who see any concession as a betrayal.
Right. Right.
So it's not just about, navigating international relations. It's also about navigating internal politics.
Right. Complicated stuff.
Very complicated. And it kind of highlights, the limitations of Aurelli's approach.
Right.
Which is very much focused on this kind of legalistic
Mm-hmm.
historical perspective.
Yeah.
And while those arguments, they definitely have emotional weight,
Mm-hmm.
they don't tell the whole story.
Right.
They don't fully account for all these other factors that are at play.
Right. The messy realities of international relations. Yeah.
Absolutely. Power dynamics, economic interests, domestic politics, all of that factors in.
Mm.
And so it's a good reminder that, sometimes there aren't any easy answers.
Right.
There aren't any clear-cut victories.
Especially when you're dealing with historical wounds like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these are things that go back generations.
Deeply, deeply felt on both sides.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
and those are difficult, those are difficult things to overcome.
Yeah. It makes you realize how limited like a purely legalistic perspective can be,
For sure. I mean, it's not, just about what's written in a treaty or in a constitution.
Right.
It's about, people's lived experiences. It's
Right.
about history. It's about, these deep-seated, senses of identity and belonging. And so I think, what we have to do is to move beyond this kind of black and white thinking
Right.
and really start thinking about, the nuances.
The shades of gray.
The shades of gray, exactly, that are inherent in these kinds of complex geopolitical situations. I mean, Aurelli's perspective is important.
Absolutely.
It's valuable. It gives us a window into, the depth of feeling
Right.
surrounding this issue. But, it's not the only perspective. And so I think, it's important to hear from all sides.
Yeah. And as always, we encourage you, the listener, to seek out those other perspectives, to
Exactly. Don't just take our word for it.
don't take our word for it. Read Aurelli's piece,
Yeah.
seek out other viewpoints.
Yeah. Read the text of the agreements.
Right. Look at the actual,
See what it actually says.
see what it says.
Yeah.
I think we were both really struck by
Yeah.
just how much this issue is about so much more than just, who controls these
All
islands.
right, absolutely. Yeah, it's about, history, it's
Hmm.
about national identity. It's about, the relationship between two countries that have this very, you know, complicated,
Fraught past.
fraught past, yeah. And I think, that's what makes it so interesting to learn about, but it's also what makes it so difficult to resolve.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you, the listener, some new perspectives on this really important issue.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe even some things to think about, to mull over.
As always, we don't have all the answers. No one does. But hopefully we've at least given you some food for thought.
And some things to maybe research further on your own if you're so inclined.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was really interesting.
Always a pleasure.